let's jump right into creating our first .NET Core web application. So here we have a File New Project dialog, and we're going to select the ASP.NET Core Web Application. Now, regardless of what type of web application you're going to create, this is what you'll select. So whether it's MVC, Razor Pages, API, doesn't matter. They're all covered under this one banner. Okay, so we're going to select that, and we need to give it a name. Let's call this Razor App, and we'll this section is going to be these first three. Now, the reality is these are just templates. It really behind the scenes is almost exactly the same. And you'll see that. But we're going to start off by saying this is the type we're going to create for the main type we want to use. The first one we'll use, and this is for this video, is the web application. Next video, we cover MVC. We'll come down here to web application MVC. And finally, API. However, we can do Razor Pages inside of MVC. We can do API calls and API controllers inside web applications. They can kind of all mix and match. So we're going to choose web application. Now, we're not going to select authentication. We're going to leave this alone for allowing the configuration of HTTPS and not enabling Docker support. We're going to cover authentication and what HTTPS is in the next section or next couple of sections. But for now, leave all these alone. So there's a basic template for web application. Hit create. This will bring in the new template, and notice down in the lower right hand corner, it's bringing in the different pieces. They came in about 2.15 seconds, which is pretty good. It's pretty fast stuff anymore. And this is the layout for a Razor Page application. Now you may wonder, well, what are Razor Pages? If you have been in this industry and using .NET for the web for probably the past 15 years or so, or were using it 15 years ago, you may remember ASP.NET Web Forms. This is very, very similar in how it lays out, how it works. However, these are not web forms. Totally different concept. But in the Visual Studio, it looks like them. And if you're not familiar, what it kind of looks like is, it kind of looks like a WinForm application where you have the UI and you have a code behind. That's kind of what it looks like. Okay, so we're going to look at that. So let's go to Pages and let's look at the index page. If I can double click on this, this is the index page, the HTML side of it. But then if you see this little arrow right here, you can expand it and select index.cshtml.cs. And that's our code behind. What this actually is is an MVVM framework for the web. So if you're familiar with WPF, WPF typically uses MVVM frameworks for its design and its building. Well, on the web, we've always had MVC, Model View Controller. This is a bit different. It's pretty close. I mean, the differences are subtle. They're not huge and overbearing. But what it means is we have some separation between our user interface, which is the HTML, and what controls it, or what the view model is for it. And that's our code behind here. So that's kind of the layout. Notice the naming conventions, which are done for us whenever we create a page. So we have index.cshtml. And so its code behind is index model class. And that inherits from page model. So that's our Razor page. And we'll get into more depth of how to do this. But that's the basic structure. Now, we've seen before app settings.json. It's already baked in when we have a Razor page setup. We have our program.cs, which is what actually launches the application. And we have our startup class, which is where we actually have our configuration. We'll go over more of this configuration in a later video. But for now, you can just read through this configuration and it pretty much makes sense. There's a lot of things in here, again, we'll cover later, but we have a cookie policy. We have compatibility version. This is where we can actually change our compatibility version for .NET Core to a different version. Also known as add MVC. We're not using MVC, right? Well, yes and no. This is all kind of in the same vein. It works together so we can actually bring in, use parts of MVC in our Razor page system. So we're reusing the same stuff instead of having different versions of it based upon which engine you're using. We're all using the same engine. Down here, again, it's very readable. If environment is in development, use developer exception pages. Otherwise, use this exception handler. This used to be something we put in the web.config file, where we'd say, okay, if you're on this system, then use this error page. Otherwise, use the yellow screen of death so the developer can see all the information. So this allows us to change things based upon if we're in development or in production. So in production, we use the exception handler that passes us off to the error page, which is right here. Also, we have HSTS. We'll cover that again in a future video in this course. We also have HTTPS redirection, static files, cookie policy, and of course using MVC. So there's a lot of stuff in here, but it's very, very readable because even though naming is hard, Microsoft worked really hard on naming things well. When you read set compatibility version, having never seen web applications before, you're pretty sure you know what that is. And that's one of the great things about good naming. So this is kind of an encouragement to you. This is kind of like a side note, but this is encouragement to you. Name things well. Because if you name things well, the person coming after you can understand what's going on and jump right in and make your application better. Okay, let's close all of this down and let's look back at this structure. So we have our dependencies. You've seen it before with our console application. Works the same way. We have, in this case, we have analyzers. We have NuGet packages. And we have, of course, the SDK. So that's very, very similar to what we have in .NET Core for consoles. Then we have our properties, including our launch settings. And this is the different launch settings depending on where we're going to launch from. We'll leave it alone for this session, but essentially we could say, okay, it's going to launch on port 5000. we're going to add a razor page. And it gave me an error. Let's try it again. Add a razor page. There we go. Little buggy, probably a Visual Studio 2019 preview bug. So let's just try it twice and it'll work. So add a razor page and hit add. We need to give it a name. So let's call this page more info. We want to generate a page model, which is that code behind. We don't want it to be a partial view. We want to use the reference script libraries, which is only available for strongly typed models, so we can leave it alone. And then use the page layout. And so we can choose which layout. If you're familiar with the full .NET framework, ASP.NET MVC, then this is probably very, very similar to what you've seen before. We don't have this generate page model class, but everything else pretty much looks like creating a new MVC view. This layout page here, which we'll look at in a minute, but the layout, what it allows us to do is create a page that has most of the content, like our header CSS and our JavaScript and our footer, and maybe some like a menu or stuff like that. And then in the middle, we stick just this content right here. That's for the privacy.cs HTML, just that little bit of HTML. So the layout page is that page that has all the rest of the stuff. We can use the default by leaving it empty, which that's the _view start, or we can choose a different one if we have more than one layout page. We're going to keep it simple and use just one layout page. I hit OK. And it's going to scaffold it out and put it inside the demo folder. And once this is done, we can now reference that page, which that's called more info. So it will be our URL /demo/more info. Not moreinfo.cshtml, just more info. And that's the routing engine behind our .NET Core web application. So let's open up the CS.html. Instead of saying more info, let's come down here below it and say, let's do an H2 tag and say, hello world. Just so we've modified it just a little bit. And we'll run this in just a minute. But first, let's look at that view start CS.html, which that says go to the layout. So even though this is the view start is where we point to everybody, it says actually go to _layout. In layout, here is where the actual website is built. So we have all this stuff. And then down here we have on line 45, render body. And that's where your code gets inserted. So our moreinfo.cs HTML, that web code, that HTML, and I know it's not code, it's markup. But that markup gets inserted at the @render body section. All right, so if you want to modify something around it, like for example, the copyright, if you want to change that, you can change it. So let's change this to I am Tim Corey. And now we're all set. We'll cover all the different things this is doing. For example, the areas, the page, and all the rest. But for now, we'll leave it alone because it just works. Okay, so we'll cover that in the future. But for right now, we just want to see how to launch this application and then how to get to the more info page. So let's launch IIS Express. We just hit that green button and it pops up a new window. And there we have our very, very plain and basic web page where it says, welcome, learn more about building web applications. And we have our /privacy. Notice the URL says now /privacy. Home doesn't have anything after it because that's the default path. Down here at the bottom, we have I am Tim Corey. We changed that. And now if we go to /demo/more info, we get more info, hello world. That's the page that I created. So that's how the basics of how to use the Razor system. It's just a folder structure that causes a naming convention. So if you're in the root of pages, you'll be on the root of your URL. So /privacy / index is the home. So there is no slash after that one. But /error. These are all based upon the root of our website because it's inside the pages folder. If you want a structure underneath that, like /demo, you just create a folder and then put Razor pages inside that. So now more info is inside the demo folder, and now we can access it doing our base URL /demo/more info. And that is the basics of the web application, which is what uses Razor pages. Now, in the next video, we'll cover the web application MVC type application, which is confusing, but essentially is called MVC. So we call this web application because it uses Razor pages. The MVC style, we just call MVC for simplicity. So .NET Core MVC.